The winter of 1623 arrived early in the lands that would someday be called Montana. By the third week of November, snow already stood knee-deep in the valleys, and the mountain passes had sealed shut for the season. A Shoshone hunter named Red Hawk crouched beside a freshly killed bull elk, his breath crystallizing in the bitter air, knowing that the meat growing cold before him represented the difference between his family's survival and starvation. Think about that for a moment. We're talking about a decision point that literally determined whether children lived or died, not in some abstract way, in the most immediate, visceral sense possible. Get this preservation wrong, and in 3 months you're watching your family waste away. Get it right, and you've bought yourself time until spring brings renewal. Red Hawk had reason to fear. The previous winter had claimed his youngest daughter, not from cold, but from the wasting sickness that came from eating spoiled meat when hunger grew too desperate. His carefully prepared winter cache, dried meat that should have lasted until spring, had rotted during an unseasonable warm spell in January. He had watched helplessly as green mold spread across the strips of venison and elk. The smell of decay had filled the storage pit. Other families in his band had suffered the same catastrophe. Children had wept with hollow bellies. Elders had grown silent, preparing their spirits for the journey to the next world. Now, when modern people talk about food preservation, we're usually thinking about extending the life of something from the grocery store. Maybe you want your lettuce to last an extra week. Perhaps you're canning tomatoes from the garden. Important? Sure. Life or death? Almost never. But for peoples living in environments where winter meant 5 months of below-freezing temperatures, where the growing season was measured in weeks, where every calorie had to come from hunting, gathering, or careful storage, this was existential. This was the razor's edge between continuation and extinction. The problem of food preservation had haunted the peoples of the northern plains for countless generations. Long before Red Hawk's time, stretching back thousands of years into the ancient days when the great ice sheets still covered the northern lands, indigenous peoples had developed sophisticated techniques for keeping meat through the long winters. They pounded dried meat with rendered fat and berries to create pemmican, a concentrated food that could last for months. They smoke-dried thin strips of buffalo and elk over carefully tended fires of cottonwood and willow. They buried meat in underground caches where the frozen earth became a natural icehouse. They even knew to ferment certain foods, allowing controlled decomposition to preserve rather than destroy. These weren't primitive solutions. They were refined over generations of careful observation, of trial and error, of accumulated wisdom passed from elders to children. Think about what it takes to develop pemmican. You need to understand the chemistry of fat saturation, the proper ratio of protein to fat, the role of berries in both flavoring and extending shelf life. You need to know which woods produce the right kind of smoke, what temperature range prevents spoilage without cooking the meat, how to recognize the early signs of decay before they become dangerous. But every method had limitations. Pemmican required large quantities of fat and berries, resources that weren't always available. Smoke drying only worked if the weather cooperated. Rain or unexpected humidity could ruin weeks of work. Underground caches failed when winters were mild or when water seeped into storage pits. And all of these techniques faced the same fundamental enemy: time. Meat began to decay the moment an animal died, and every preservation method was simply a strategy to slow that inevitable process. For the Shoshone and their neighbors, the Crow to the north, the Flathead to the west, the Northern Cheyenne to the east, this wasn't merely a practical challenge. It was sacred responsibility. The buffalo, the elk, the deer all gave their bodies willingly so that humans might live. This was the ancient covenant, the balance that kept the world in harmony. To kill an animal and then allow its meat to spoil was not just wasteful, it was spiritual violation. It dishonored the animal's sacrifice. It broke faith with the sacred circle of life and death. So when Red Hawk knelt beside that elk in November of 1623, he carried the weight of more than immediate survival. He carried the memory of his daughter's death. He carried the responsibility to his remaining children and his wife. He carried the knowledge of his ancestors and the expectations of his community. And he carried an absolutely crushing question. How could he preserve this meat better than he had managed the previous year? The answer, when it came, arrived through a combination of desperation and cultural memory. An elderly woman in his band, a grandmother named Speaks with Thunder, who had lived through more than 70 winters, recalled a story her own grandmother had told. Far to the south and west, in the direction of the setting sun, there were places where the earth itself produced white crystals that never melted. These crystals had power over meat. They could stop the rot. They could preserve flesh for seasons beyond counting. Salt. She was describing salt deposits. But for Red Hawk's people, who lived in the northern forests and mountains far from natural salt sources, it might as well have been describing magic. Understanding the geography here matters. The northern Shoshone territories in what's now Montana and Idaho were magnificent landscapes, mountains that touched the sky, valleys thick with game, rivers full of fish, but they were notably lacking in accessible salt deposits. The nearest, significant sources were hundreds of miles away, through mountain ranges that became impassable in winter. Trade networks existed. Certainly indigenous peoples throughout the Americas had maintained complex exchange systems for millennia. But salt was precious, difficult to obtain, and rarely available in quantities sufficient for large-scale meat preservation. So when Speaks with Thunder told Red Hawk about the salt places her grandmother had described, she was essentially pointing him toward a location that might not even exist, or might exist but be impossible to reach, or might be controlled by other groups who wouldn't welcome a Shoshone hunter entering their territory. The chances of success were slim, the dangers were substantial, and winter was already closing in. Red Hawk made his decision with the kind of cold calculation that only comes from having already lost a child. The elk meat would last perhaps 2 weeks in the November cold. His family's other food stores were adequate, but not abundant. If he left immediately, if he could find this salt place before the deepest snows arrived, he might return in time to preserve not just the elk, but whatever other game he and the band's hunters could bring down before winter truly set in. He prepared for a journey into the unknown with nothing but stories and hope as his guides. And somewhere high in the mountains, in places where the earth's deep heat pushed ancient minerals to the surface, white crystals waited to transform everything Red Hawk's people understood about survival. The question is, would he find them before winter sealed away the mountain passes forever? And if he did, if he actually discovered these salt deposits and learned how to use them properly, what would that mean not just for his family, but for generations yet unborn? The stakes couldn't have been higher, the clock couldn't have been tighter, and the knowledge he was about to rediscover would ripple forward through time in ways he could never have imagined. Red Hawk left before dawn on the 3rd day after killing the elk. His wife had bundled what remained of the meat in leather wrappings, preserving what she could with smoke and cold. His 2 surviving children, a son of 9 winters and a daughter of 6, understood without being told that their father was attempting something dangerous. They had lived through the previous winter. They remembered their sister's death. They knew what failure meant. The journey itself was a gamble against time and geography. Speaks with Thunder's directions were frustratingly vague, built from memories of stories told decades earlier. Travel toward the setting sun. Look for valleys where steam rises from the earth even in deepest winter. Follow the smell of sulfur and heat. Find the white places where nothing grows. Now think about what this means in practical terms. Red Hawk was heading into unfamiliar territory. In late November, following directions that amounted to go west and look for weird things. No maps, no GPS coordinates, no certainty that what he was looking for even existed, just stories and desperation. He traveled light winter clothing, weapons, a small amount of food, leather bags for carrying whatever he might find. Speed mattered more than comfort. Every day that passed was a day closer to impassable snows, a day closer to the elk meat spoiling beyond salvation. The first 3 days brought him through familiar hunting grounds, forests of lodgepole pine and Douglas fir, valleys where elk and deer left tracks in the early snow, streams that ran cold and clear. By the 4th day, he had moved beyond the lands his people regularly traveled. The mountains here were higher, steeper, the valleys narrower and more forbidding. On the 6th day, he caught his first hint that Speaks with Thunder's stories might be real. Rising from a narrow canyon ahead, he saw something that didn't belong in a winter landscape steam. thick columns of it rising into the cold air like smoke from enormous invisible fires. His heart, which had been heavy with doubt, suddenly pounded with possibility. He approached carefully. The steam came from pools of water, but water unlike any he had encountered. It bubbled and hissed. The rocks around it were stained in colors that had no names, yellow and orange and rust red. The smell was overwhelming, sulphurous and alien. And the heat radiating from the pools was so intense that snow melted in wide circles around them, leaving bare earth steaming in the November cold. These were hot springs, driven by the same geological forces that would later make Yellowstone famous. But Red Hawk had no framework for understanding what he was seeing beyond the immediate practical reality: heat, water, and strange formations around the edges of the pools. He spent 2 days exploring the area, and this is where the story becomes really interesting from a technological standpoint. Because Red Hawk didn't just stumble onto salt and immediately know what to do with it. He had to figure it out through observation and experimentation, under pressure, with winter closing in. The hot spring pools themselves weren't what he needed. The water was scalding, dangerous, undrinkable. But around the pools, where the heated water had evaporated over countless years, white and grey crusts had formed, deposits of minerals concentrated by evaporation. Salt, but also other compounds, sulfates, carbonates, all the dissolved minerals that the hot water had carried up from deep in the earth. Red Hawk tasted the white crusts cautiously. Some burned his tongue, bitter and caustic. Others tasted like nothing at all. But some, particularly the purest white formations that had built up in layered deposits, away from the most sulphurous pools, tasted sharp and clean. They tasted like the precious substance that occasionally appeared in trade goods from the south. Salt. Here's what makes this moment so crucial. Red Hawk had to connect the dots between these white mineral deposits and the preservation properties that Speaks with Thunder had described. He had to understand that this substance, this earth-produced crystal that tasted sharp on the tongue, could somehow stop meat from rotting. That's not an obvious connection. Salt preservation requires understanding that you need to thoroughly coat the meat, that you need to use enough salt to really penetrate the flesh, that timing and technique matter. But Red Hawk had advantages. He came from a culture with sophisticated food processing knowledge. He understood that different treatments produced different results. He had seen how smoke affected meat, how drying worked, how fat could be rendered and used. He was primed to experiment, to test, to learn. He spent a full day carefully gathering the best salt deposits he could find, scraping the purest white crusts into his leather bags, selecting formations that were as free from sulfur contamination as possible. He collected what he estimated was perhaps 20 pounds of salt. Not a huge amount, but if it worked, if it truly had the preservation powers the stories claimed, it might be enough. The return journey was a race against the calendar. Snow fell steadily on the 8th day, heavy, wet flakes that accumulated rapidly. The mountain passes were beginning to close. Red Hawk pushed hard, traveling until darkness made progress impossible, rising before dawn to continue. He arrived home on the 15th day after leaving. His wife and children had been preparing for his death 15 days, was at the outer limit of how long anyone could reasonably expect to survive alone in the mountains in late November. When he stumbled into camp, exhausted and half frozen, carrying bags of white crystals, the entire band gathered to see what he had brought. Now came the real test. Red Hawk had salt. But did he know how to use it? Working with the elk meat that remained, much of it beginning to show signs of deterioration, and with fresh deer that other hunters had recently killed, Red Hawk and his wife began experimenting. They rubbed salt into meat, trying different amounts and techniques. They packed meat in salt, creating layers. They mixed salt with water to create brines and submerged meat in the solution. The results weren't immediate. Food preservation is a waiting game. You treat the meat, and then you wait to see if it spoils. Days passed. Weeks passed. The successfully preserved pieces began to show themselves through negative evidence they weren't rotting while untreated meat was. By mid-December, the pattern was clear. Meat heavily treated with salt remained edible, while untreated meat turned green and toxic. The salt was working. But more than that, Red Hawk and his wife were learning the nuances. They discovered that fresh meat took salt better than meat that had already begun to age. They learned that cutting meat into thinner pieces allowed better salt penetration. They found that some combinations of salting and drying produced superior results to either technique alone. Word spread through the band, then to other Shoshone groups. Before that winter ended, Red Hawk made 2 more journeys to the hot spring valleys, once in late January during a brief warm spell, once in early March as winter began to break. Other hunters accompanied him. They gathered salt, learned the location of the deposits, began building collective knowledge about which formations produced the best preservation salt. This is how technological innovation actually happens in human societies. Not through sudden brilliant insights, but through desperate need meeting available resources, through experimentation and refinement, through the sharing of knowledge across communities. Red Hawk didn't invent salt preservation. Humans had been doing it for thousands of years in various parts of the world. What he did was recover and adapt that knowledge for his specific environment and share it with his people. By the winter of 1624, just 1 year after his first desperate journey, Shoshone bands throughout the region had access to salt and were actively using it. The impact on survival rates was measurable. Fewer children died from starvation, fewer elders weakened by eating spoiled meat. The bands could maintain larger winter camps because food security had improved. They could take down more game knowing they had the means to preserve it. But here's where the story takes a turn that Red Hawk couldn't have anticipated. Because the knowledge he recovered didn't stay within Shoshone communities, it couldn't. In the complex network of trade, warfare, alliance, and cultural exchange that characterized indigenous societies across the Americas, innovations spread, sometimes slowly, sometimes rapidly, but inevitably. Within a generation, numerous tribes across the northern plains and Rocky Mountains knew about the salt deposits and were using salt preservation techniques. The knowledge became embedded in cultural practices, passed from elders to children, refined through continued experimentation, adapted to local conditions and preferences. And then, in a twist of historical irony that Red Hawk's descendants would later find bitter and strange, European colonizers arrived in force. They came with their own salt preservation traditions, their own techniques refined over centuries of European experience. They encountered indigenous peoples who had their own sophisticated preservation methods. What happened next set the stage for one of the most devastating cultural and economic transformations in North American history. Because the salt preservation techniques that indigenous peoples had perfected, the knowledge that people like Red Hawk had risked their lives to recover and share, would be turned into industrial-scale tools of their own destruction. But before we get to that tragedy, we need to understand just how effective these preservation techniques had become, and how deeply they were woven into the fabric of Plains Indian life. We need to see the full flowering of this knowledge before we watch it be weaponized against the very people who perfected it. By the middle of the 19th century, roughly 200 years after Red Hawk's journey, the buffalo-based economy of the Great Plains had reached its apex. We're talking about one of the most successful adaptations to a challenging environment that human societies have ever achieved. Millions of people, dozens of distinct tribal nations, living in relative prosperity across an enormous geographic area, all sustained by sophisticated hunting and preservation techniques. Let's talk numbers for a minute, because the scale here is almost incomprehensible. The Great Plains buffalo herds at their peak numbered somewhere between 30 and 60 million animals. That's not a typo. 30 to 60 million. Witnesses described herds that took days to pass a single point, covering the landscape from horizon to horizon, raising dust clouds that could be seen for miles. And Plains tribes had developed incredibly efficient systems for utilizing these animals. A large buffalo hunt might take down dozens or even hundreds of animals in a single communal effort. Then began the real work, the processing. Every part of the buffalo was used. Meat for immediate eating, meat for preservation through drying, smoking, salting, hides for shelter, clothing, containers, bones for tools, sinews for thread and bowstrings, organs for specific ceremonial and practical purposes. Nothing wasted, everything honored. The preservation techniques had become remarkably sophisticated by this point. Tribes had refined the salt and dry methods that hunters like Red Hawk had pioneered. They had perfected pemmican production to the point where it had become a trade commodity, carefully calibrated mixtures of dried meat, rendered fat, and berries that could last for years and provided incredible caloric density. They had developed multiple variations tailored to different seasons, different meat types, different intended storage durations. Think about what this represents in terms of accumulated knowledge. You're looking at centuries of careful observation, experimentation, and refinement. Understanding the chemistry of preservation without having modern scientific frameworks, knowing through experience what modern food scientists would later explain through bacterial growth curves and water activity measurements. But here's where the story turns dark. Because the same preservation technology that allowed plains tribes to thrive, that let them harvest buffalo efficiently and store the meat through seasons, also enabled the industrial-scale slaughter that would destroy the buffalo herds and, with them, the indigenous way of life. Starting in the late 1860s and accelerating through the 1870s, professional buffalo hunters, mostly white men, equipped with powerful rifles and backed by Eastern capital, began systematically killing buffalo for their hides. The mathematics of destruction were staggering. A single skilled hunter equipped with a Sharps rifle could kill 100 buffalo in a day. The animals were shot from a distance, the hunter working methodically through a herd, often without even moving from his position. The buffalo, not understanding the danger of the distant crack of rifles, would simply stand near their fallen companions until they too were shot. Once the killing was done, skinning crews would process the carcasses. The hides were the primary product, shipped east for leather goods and industrial belts. But here's the crucial part. The meat was preserved with salt, loaded onto wagons, and transported to railroad depots. Without salt preservation, this industrial hunting operation would have been impossible. The meat would have spoiled before reaching markets. The economics wouldn't have worked. But with salt preservation, hunters could operate far from supply lines and process enormous quantities of meat. The techniques they used? Largely adapted from indigenous methods. The knowledge of how to cure buffalo meat, how to prepare it for long-term storage, how to transport it across vast distances, this had been developed by plains tribes over generations. European and American settlers had learned from indigenous peoples, sometimes through direct teaching, more often through observation and adaptation. Between 1870 and 1883, the buffalo population of the Great Plains collapsed from approximately 30 million animals to fewer than 1,000. Read that again. 30 million to 1,000. In 13 years. It's one of the fastest large mammal population collapses in recorded history, and it was entirely human-caused. Some U.S. military and political leaders explicitly supported the buffalo extermination as strategy for controlling native populations. General Philip Sheridan reportedly said that buffalo hunters did more to settle the vexed Indian question than the entire regular army had done in the previous 40 years. The logic was coldly strategic. Plains tribes depended utterly on buffalo for food, shelter, clothing, tools, and trade goods. Eliminate the buffalo, and you eliminate native independence. Let that sink in. The preservation technology that Red Hawk had risked his life to recover, that had saved his family from starvation, that had spread across the plains as a tool of survival. That same technology was now being used at industrial scale to destroy the very foundation of indigenous life. By the mid-1880s, the great buffalo herds were gone. The enormous communal hunts where hundreds of people would work together, processing dozens of animals, preserving tons of meat while singing, praying, and reinforcing. Cultural bonds ended abruptly. The sophisticated preservation knowledge that tribes had developed and refined over generations suddenly had no purpose. There was nothing to preserve. The human cost was catastrophic. Starvation became widespread on reservations where tribes had been confined. The U.S. government provided rations, but these were often inadequate, of poor quality, and delivered irregularly. People who had been prosperous just years earlier, who had mastered one of the world's most challenging environments and built sophisticated societies, were reduced to dependency and poverty. But there's another layer to this tragedy that's often overlooked. The destruction wasn't just economic or nutritional. It was the shattering of entire knowledge systems. Elderly Shoshone, Cheyenne, Crow, and Lakota people who had spent their lives mastering the arts of preservation found their expertise worthless. Young people, sent to government boarding schools where they were forbidden to speak their languages or practice their customs, never learned the traditional methods. The cultural transmission broke. Think about what that means. Imagine you've spent decades becoming an expert in something really expert, not just competent, but masterful. You know subtleties that can't be written down, nuances that can only be learned through experience. You're prepared to pass this knowledge to the next generation, as it was passed to you, and then, suddenly, completely, it becomes obsolete. Not because something better came along, but because the entire framework that gave your expertise meaning has been deliberately destroyed. The reservation system that confined surviving native populations in the late 19th century completed the economic destruction. Reservation lands were typically marginal areas, rejected by white settlers. Hunting was restricted or impossible. Government rations of flour, sugar, and lard replaced the traditional diet. The entire knowledge system built around procuring, processing, and preserving wild game became obsolete within a single generation. A bitter irony haunted this transformation. The preservation techniques that had saved countless native families from starvation, the hard-won wisdom of people like Red Hawk, who had risked everything to recover ancestral knowledge, had been adapted and industrialized to destroy the very way of life they had sustained. The innovation that once meant survival had become the infrastructure of dispossession. And yet, and this is important, the knowledge didn't completely die. It couldn't. Because cultural knowledge, when it's deeply embedded, when it's tied to identity and spirituality and connection to ancestors, has a resilience that purely technical knowledge doesn't. Families held on to fragments. Elders whispered stories. Practices went underground but didn't disappear entirely. They would need that resilience. Because the forces that had destroyed the buffalo economy and shattered the Plains tribes' way of life were just beginning to build the industrial food system that would transform America, and that system would be built, in part, on foundations that indigenous peoples had laid. By 1900, the transformation was complete. The United States had expanded from Atlantic to Pacific, connected by transcontinental railroads, dotted with growing cities and towns, its interior territories filling with farms, ranches, and settlements. And everywhere, in frontier homes, in railroad camps, in military forts, in the enormous meatpacking operations of Chicago and Kansas City, salt preservation sustained American expansion. The Union stockyards in Chicago processed millions of cattle, pigs, and sheep every year. We're talking about an industrial operation on a scale that would have been unimaginable just 50 years earlier. Enormous factories transformed animals into an astonishing array of products. Fresh meat for local markets, salted and cured meats for distant shipping, canned products, leather goods, fertilizer, glue, soap. The companies that dominated this industry, Armour, Swift, Morris, built fortunes measured in the millions of dollars. They employed tens of thousands of workers. They pioneered industrial efficiency techniques that influenced manufacturing worldwide. The technology at the heart of this empire was salt preservation. Yes, refrigeration was beginning to emerge. The first refrigerated railroad cars appeared in the 1870s, but salt remained essential. Bacon, ham, salt pork, corned beef, dried beef, jerky. All of these products depended on preservation principles refined over centuries. And while the industrial scale was new, the fundamental techniques had deep roots. Those roots stretched back through American frontier experience, through European peasant traditions, through Mediterranean civilizations, through Middle Eastern cultures, and ultimately to the earliest human societies that discovered salt's preservative powers. Salt preservation was ancient, and global humans had been salting fish and meat for at least 10,000 years on every inhabited continent. But here's what gets erased from the story. The specific refinements that made American frontier expansion possible, the particular combinations of salting, smoking, and drying suited to plains game, the knowledge of seasonal timing and storage conditions for varying climates, the sophisticated understanding of different salt types and their properties. These had been developed by indigenous peoples over countless generations. Red Hawk hadn't invented salt preservation. He had rediscovered and transmitted knowledge that was both ancestral and adapted to the specific challenges of northern plains and mountain environments. Yet by the 1920s and 30s, this history had vanished from American consciousness. Families prepared salt-cured ham for Sunday dinners, without any awareness they were using techniques that native peoples had perfected. Ranchers made jerky using methods learned from indigenous neighbors, never acknowledging the source. Food companies manufactured products based on indigenous preservation wisdom while marketing them as products of American ingenuity or European heritage. The erasure was so complete that even academic historians typically credited American food preservation practices to European, particularly German and Scandinavian, immigrant traditions. Native contributions were simply invisible. You could read entire books about the development of the American food industry without finding a single reference to indigenous knowledge or innovation. Meanwhile, on reservations throughout the West, native communities struggled with poverty, food insecurity, and cultural suppression. The U.S. government's explicit policy for decades was forced assimilation, eliminating indigenous languages, religions, customs, and knowledge systems. Children were taken from their families and sent to boarding schools, where they were punished for speaking their native languages or practicing traditional ways. The sophisticated body of knowledge around food procurement, processing, and preservation was actively targeted for destruction as part of making native peoples into civilized farmers and laborers. But knowledge, once it truly takes root in a culture, is remarkably resilient. In quiet ways, away from government agents and missionaries, families preserved fragments of traditional practices, a grandmother teaching her granddaughter to cure a deer hide using old methods, an uncle showing his nephew the proper way to prepare meat for drying. Small acts of cultural resistance and continuity that, individually, might seem insignificant, but, collectively, maintained threads of connection to ancestral wisdom. Beginning in the 1970s, as indigenous rights movements gained strength and federal policies shifted away from explicit cultural destruction toward supporting tribal sovereignty, a remarkable revival began. Native scholars, community elders, and activists started systematically documenting traditional knowledge before the last generations who learned the old ways passed on. This wasn't nostalgia. This was urgent cultural preservation work, recording practices that were literally dying with elderly knowledge keepers. Food sovereignty became a central concern, and here's why. Reservations throughout the United States faced epidemic levels of diabetes, heart disease, and obesity health crises directly linked to the loss of traditional diets and their replacement with processed, sugar, and fat-heavy government commodities and cheap industrial foods. Returning to traditional foods and preparation methods wasn't about recreating some romanticized past. It was a public health imperative with life or death stakes. Throughout the northern plains and mountain west, tribal communities began reviving traditional preservation techniques. Annual gatherings where elders teach younger generations how to process and preserve meat using methods passed down from ancestors. Buffalo restoration programs, with tribes reintroducing the animals to reservation lands and relearning communal hunting and processing techniques. Language revitalization efforts that include the vocabulary and concepts around food preparation. Today, you can find northern Shoshone families harvesting salt from the same high mountain valleys that Red Hawk visited nearly 400 years ago. They prepare elk and deer using techniques that blend ancient wisdom with modern food safety knowledge. They gather in autumn to share the work and teach children, telling stories that connect present practice to distant ancestors. The revival isn't about recreating a vanished past, it's about cultural continuity and adaptation. Modern indigenous peoples live in the same complex contemporary world as everyone else. They use smartphones, drive cars, watch television, navigate the same challenges of modern life. But they're reclaiming aspects of their heritage that offer both practical benefits and spiritual connection. They're saying, "We're still here, our cultures are still alive, and the knowledge our ancestors fought to preserve still has value." The broader legacy is more subtle, but equally profound. Every time anyone, anywhere prepares salted meat, cures a ham, makes jerky, or preserves fish. They're participating in a tradition that stretches back through millennia of human ingenuity across every culture and continent. The specific American version of that tradition, the techniques that sustained frontier expansion, that built industrial food empires, that still produce billions of dollars of cured meat products annually, was shaped significantly by indigenous innovation. Red Hawk's name is forgotten. We don't know if Red Hawk was even his real name or a name assigned to him in the retelling of this story. The names of countless other native people who perfected preservation techniques across centuries are lost to history. No monuments commemorate their contributions, no textbooks credit their innovations, but their legacy persists in every kitchen, in every industrial facility, in the fundamental infrastructure of how humans keep food safe and available across seasons and distances. The story of salt preservation is ultimately a story of human persistence and adaptation. It's a story of desperate innovation, born from necessity, of knowledge refined over generations, of cultural transmission through the darkest periods of suppression, and of revival by descendants determined to honor and continue ancestral wisdom. In the Montana mountains, where Red Hawk once climbed seeking salvation for his starving family, white salt crusts still form around hot springs. The earth still offers its gifts. The ancient cycles continue, and somewhere, people who carry his blood and his culture's memory still practice the arts of preservation, still tell the stories, still keep the circle unbroken. Think about that the next time you eat bacon for breakfast or pack jerky for a hiking trip. You're not just eating preserved meat, you're participating in a tradition that connects you to countless generations of human innovation stretching back through time. And embedded in that tradition, invisible but essential, is the knowledge of indigenous peoples who faced challenges we can barely imagine and created solutions that still sustain us today. That's not the story we usually tell ourselves about American food. We prefer simpler narratives, European techniques brought to the New World, American ingenuity, creating industrial efficiency, modern technology, improving on primitive methods. But history is never that simple. The truth is more complicated, more interconnected, and ultimately more interesting than the sanitized versions we've inherited. The preservation techniques we take for granted today, techniques that feed billions of people, that sustain global trade, that make modern urban life possible, carry within them the accumulated wisdom of peoples whose contributions have been deliberately erased from our collective memory. Recovering that history doesn't diminish anyone else's innovations. It enriches our understanding of how human knowledge actually develops, through exchange, adaptation, and the persistent effort of countless individuals trying to solve the fundamental challenge of keeping themselves and their families alive. Red Hawk climbed those mountains in 1623, driven by desperation and love. He returned with salt and hope. His descendants faced genocide, cultural destruction, and deliberate erasure, but they endured. The knowledge survived. And today, in small but significant ways, it's being reclaimed, celebrated, and passed forward. That's a story worth remembering. That's a legacy worth honoring. Not because that makes us feel good about the past. The past was often brutal and unjust, but because understanding where our knowledge comes from makes us more honest, more humble, and more connected to the full complexity of human history. In the end, the white salt crystals that Red Hawk gathered from those hot spring valleys 4 centuries ago are still there, still forming, still waiting. The earth's generosity continues, and the circle, though bent and broken many times over, has never been completely severed. It stretches across time, connecting us all past, present, and future in the simple, profound act of preserving food so that life can continue.